on the Hill. You have, the National Guard, you have the Pentagon playing a role in this, you have the Capitol Police officers and the chief playing a role in this. And one of the things that came out today is this question about this police board, where the chief of police for Capitol Hill Police has to go to a board for approval on items. So it seems like there are so many people involved in a decision that really needs to have some very quick thinking, and to see all of these layers put out there of how many people needed to be on the phone, how many people are involved with this decision of who to send in. It's really just so startling to think about that when you know the dangers, and we've seen these videos come out of the crowd and how they were gathered here, how they had gear here, zip ties, bear spray, all of that. And during all of that time, there were these phone calls that were taking place where it seemed like people didn't quite understand how dangerous the situation was, or weren't reacting as quickly as they should have.
And Rhonda, we heard from
March of 2020, when the economy was in free fall and businesses and places of employment were shut down. And how were they shut down? By those of us right here in the Congress of the United States, the federal government, doing it by government edict. While many individuals in certain sectors of our economy continue to struggle, and of course deserve a helping hand, others have largely recovered and are no longer in need of assistance. So, at this time, instead of $2 trillion, two-thirds of it not needed, why not help those hurting and not pour gasoline on the inflationary fires? A COVID relief package should reflect this reality in both size and scope. Even longtime Democrat economists, such as Obama's former Director of National Security Economic Council, have raised concerns about enacting nearly a $2 trillion stimulus package at this point when we're already in recovery. So, as former Secretary of Treasury Summers, besides I also referred to him as Director of National Economic Economist, this is what he says, quote, "The proposed Biden stimulus is 3 times as large as the gap between actual and potential output as estimated by the CBO. Enacting a stimulus unmoored from economic reality poses real risks to our economy, including inflation and slower economic growth moving forward. In fact, the Penn-Wharton budget model and that analysis of the president's proposed projects, the proposed stimulus would result in a decrease in both GDP and wages in 2022 and over the next 2 decades. While inflation has been subdued in recent years, we shouldn't let that lull in inflation lull us into a false sense of confidence that we can spend with impunity with no consequences. We are in uncharted waters with debt held by the public exceeding the size of our economy and trillion-dollar annual deficits. Moreover, as economists John Greenwood and Steve Hank, professors of economics at Johns Hopkins, recently warned, quote, "The money supply will grow by nearly 12% this year. That's twice as fast as its average growth rate from 2000 to 2019. It's a rate that spells trouble, inflation trouble," end of quote. And that is without another round of stimulus that we're going to be debating the next few days here on the floor of the United States Senate and probably passing before the end of the week. Concern of inflation has been dismissed by the White House and by the Federal Reserve. This sounds too familiar to those of us who witnessed the stagflation of the 1970s. We were told by President Nixon and his advisors that they could spend their way to lower unemployment and economic growth without inflation. They were wrong. The Nixon administration mistakes ushered in a decade of disastrous inflation. And I've said for decades, if Nixon did something, we ought to learn from it and not repeat it. It was with this background of stagflation that I first ran for Congress on a platform of fighting inflation. Inflation is a regressive stealth tax on every single American. It is particularly unfair to those who have very little money to begin with. and those who have lived beneath their incomes to save for the future, only to see their hard work wiped out as the value of the dollars that they put away plunges. Hopefully, Nixon inflation is only history, never to retain. But none of us can guarantee that inflation won't return. Not only is the size of this stimulus package detached from reality, so is its scope. A common adage for stimulus and economic relief measures is that they should be timely, they should be temporary, and they should be targeted. By this standard, the Democrat stimulus is well wide of the mark. More than 1/3, or about $700 billion of the funding in the bill, wouldn't even be spent until 2022 or beyond, according to the CBO. How does anybody know that we need a stimulus in 2022 and beyond? By what standard does the Biden administration say that we're going to need that? And isn't that got something to do about the failure of this bill to accomplish what it wants to accomplish, or even the need for it, if some of this money won't be spent until the outer years? I don't know about you, but I don't see how spending hundreds of billions of dollars years from now is either timely or targeted, as these economists talk about a stimulus. If it's going to be any good, it needs to be timely and targeted. How does it, or what does all this have to do with fighting the pandemic right now? The people hurting right now. Are these same people going to be hurting in these out years when some of this money is going to be spent? If that's the case, this brand new administration is already admitting that their policies of the future are a failure, and a failure today. Nearly a quarter of the package, or $422 billion, is dedicated to direct payments to households with incomes up to $200,000, all regardless of whether they have lost a job or experienced any loss of income. Such untargeted payments make little sense when just this past week it was reported that personal income was up 10%, personal savings rates soared to over 20%. We clearly shouldn't be using taxpayers' dollars to pad the bank accounts of those with six-figure incomes, when we ought to be targeting this towards those who are unemployed and those who are low income. Then we have another $350 billion of this package going to be allocated to bail out fiscally irresponsible states at the expense of states that have managed their state budgets wisely, like my home state of Iowa. This spending is hard to justify, given recent reports indicating most states saw little to no drop in revenue between 2019 and 2020. And many states that were previously projecting shortfalls are now projecting budget surpluses. The package also includes hundreds of billions of dollars in liberal wish list priorities that have very little to do with the current pandemic. This includes enhancements to refundable tax credits, an expansion of Obamacare subsidies, and an $86 billion taxpayer bailout of poorly managed pension plans. And on poorly managed pension plans, that's something that I've been trying to reform over the last 2 years. And reform is necessary as much as helping them with some taxpayers' dollars. But there's absolutely no reforms in this stimulus of those multi-employer pension plans. It's simply an $86 billion bailout. In the case of COVID, there are some things that no amount of money can address. Until the widespread immunity is achieved, many people will not feel comfortable eating out, going to a movie, taking in a concert, or traveling on a vacation. Spending trillions of dollars will not change the attitude of those people that are going to still be very cautious. So here's what I'd spend the money on, and a lot less money than $1 9/10 trillion. So yes, let's prioritize funding for vaccine distribution, assistance for the unemployed, and aid for small businesses in the struggling sectors. And by all means, let's open our schools. Doing this doesn't require $2 trillion. Let's remove the pork in this bill. Let's set aside the long-term left-wing wish lists and work together as we did before in those 5 bipartisan bills over the last 12 months, and they have passed both bodies overwhelmingly. Several of my Republican colleagues approached the White House a few weeks ago with a list similar to what I just said, maybe a longer list of items proposed by President Biden that could get Republican support with minimal tweaks. A bipartisan package along those lines could well have passed a few days ago. It's still not too late. I hope we can make a bipartisan effort happen yet. I yield the floor and I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from Wyoming.
Thank you, Madam President. First, I'd like to associate myself with outstanding remarks from the senior senator from Iowa, whose long experience in this body is one that we all look to with great admiration and respect. And when he speaks of this, he's well known for his fundamental focus on taxpayer dollars and making sure money isn't wasted, make sure money is directed to the areas where it is supposed to go, where it is needed the most. And when he points out how this is a bill basically piled on with pork, and he's from Iowa, he knows about pork, he points out how misguided this effort is, how expensive it is, and how misdirected it is. So I just jumped to associate myself with these wonderful remarks of the senior senator from Iowa, and it's a pleasure and privilege to serve with him. I also come to the floor today, Madam President, to talk about the need for integrity in our elections. In 2020, the American people voted for a 50-50 Senate. We're in that body today. And gave Republicans nearly a dozen more seats in the House of Representatives. In the presidential election, 37 electoral votes were decided by less than 1% in those states. Without those 37 electoral votes, President Biden would have failed to achieve a majority in the Electoral College. This was a close election. And the reason it's a close election is it's a closely divided country. I'm home every weekend in Wyoming, and the two things I hear about is one, this massive bill in front of the Senate right now of $1.9 trillion amount of money that's all going to be added to the debt and the concern for that spending. And the other issue is the integrity of our elections. So we have a close election, we have a closely divided country. If you would think anything, that should be a mandate to move to the middle, to find common ground, to work for solutions. It's the kind of things that the president talked about in his inaugural address on January 20th. At a time like this, Americans want to make sure that our own elections are safe and secure and fair. I think voters, no matter what their political party or predisposition is, I think all voters deserve that, and they want it. But when Republicans raise questions about the integrity of the election, well, we are attacked, and we've seen that now. In fact, earlier this very week, the majority leader of the United States Senate spoke of, in his, and quote, the pernicious and nasty guise of election integrity. Pernicious and nasty guise of election integrity, the majority leader of the United States Senate. He attacked the motives of millions of Americans who want to be confident in our elections. Every American ought to want to be confident in our elections. But it looks like some Democrats who may accuse us of this, many Democrats share our concerns. I hear that both sides of the aisle. Democrats in Iowa right now are contesting a congressional race. As I stand here, Democrats in the House are considering the most sweeping concern, and this is the reason I'm here, is that Democrats in the House are considering the most sweeping changes to election laws in decades. Their bill is nearly 800 pages long. It's called House Bill Number 1. Number 1. Look, to me, that means it's their number one priority. Otherwise, why would they introduce it as their first bill and label it as House Bill Number 1? House Bill Number 1 for the Democrats in the House, it's not coronavirus. It's not jobs. It's not schools. It's a change in the election process for the American people and a big mandate coming out of Washington. So the number one priority of House Democrats is not those key issues, but their number one issue is elections and changing elections in our country. Well, the bill, interestingly, didn't go through a normal committee process as bills are supposed to do into the House or the Senate. Went straight to the floor. Nancy Pelosi's desk, floor of the United States House of Representatives. Hundreds of pages are in there, Madam President, of new mandates. And it tells each of our states how to hold elections. It doesn't say states, you do it. It tells the states how to do it. These aren't just any mandates. These are radical left-wing mandates that people in my home state of Wyoming view as scary and say would make the elections less secure. This bill is so radical that an earlier version of it was felt to be too liberal even for the ACLU. And the latest version is even more liberal than that. Well, I'm just going to mention, Madam President, a few of the mandates in this bill. So House Bill Number 1 would force every state to give the vote to convicted felons. Not a state choice, federal mandate. One group of Democrats even tried to give the vote to felons who are still in prison right now, and that amendment failed. House Bill Number 1 would force every state to allow same-day voter registration, online voter registration, and even automatic voter registration. Automatic voter registration? Voter registration is something somebody should have to do, register to vote. If the bill became law, you would be registered to vote automatically without even knowing it. And when the states automatically register you, you're not allowed to find out how they got your information. Can't tell you. In effect, voter registration would be a thing of the past. The thing that we all did as young people, register to vote, thing of the past. House Bill Number 1 forces states to count provisional ballots statewide. So if you vote Democrat in one district, and if you're from another district, they'll count it as a vote for the Democrat in your district. Mistakes like this shouldn't happen, let alone should your vote be able to be changed from the vote you actually cast. The bill also doubles down on mail-in voting. The problems with that, I think people would agree, are obvious. You know, Amazon, and many of us shop on Amazon, if not everyone, Amazon recently tried to restrict mail-in voting for a union election at one of its facilities. That's not because Amazon has conservative leadership. It's because they say it is harder to secure mail-in voting than it is to secure in-person voting. If you want an accurate vote, in-person voting is more accurate. The reason mail-in voting was expanded last year was because of the pandemic. But now Democrats want to carve it into stone forever. H.R. 1 would also take government funding and give it to political campaigns. American people have some thoughts on that. The bill actually has a 6-to-1 match for campaign donations under $200. So if you donate $100 to your favorite candidate, the federal government would take taxpayer dollars and give an additional $600 of taxpayer money to that candidate who just got a $100 check. Hardworking people would pay their taxes knowing that their hard-earned dollars are going to go fund political activity, even activity that they don't necessarily agree with. Like so many liberal government programs, this is a system that could easily be defrauded. We see that now with the coronavirus bill as well. Democrats know that they would still get their big corporate donations in New York and in San Francisco, but now they'd get an added bonus 6-to-1 match from taxpayers. H.R. 1 would also give government-funded vouchers for people to donate to political campaigns. Political campaigns do not need taxpayer subsidies. People can decide how they want to spend their own money. The government shouldn't be redirecting it toward a party in power. Democrats complain about money in politics all of the time. The solution, seeing in House Bill number 1 apparently, is more money in politics, as long as it's the taxpayer money. H.R. 1 ends the equal balance between the Republican and Democrats on the Federal Election Commission. Ends it. Democrats want to politicize the commission that enforces our election laws. They want to make it a partisan organization. It's just another idea that would make it easier to commit fraud. H.R. 1 doesn't just politicize the Federal Election Commission. It politicizes the Internal Revenue Service, the IRS. Democrats want to break down the guardrails that currently keep the IRS out of politics. H.R. 1 gets rid of any of the limits on the IRS when giving tax exemptions to nonprofits. Now think about this. Remember, the scandal at the IRS under the Obama-Biden administration. Scandal, headlines, people well aware. Well, H.R. 1 enshrines that into law. H.R. 1 gives a big stamp of approval to Lois Lerner and her behavior in the way she worked the IRS. Every Democrat who votes for the bill is saying that they will endorse what happened at the IRS under President Obama. And there's more, a lot more. The bill goes on and on. It's 800 pages. Hard to believe too many Democrats have actually read it. Bottom line is this: H.R. 1 would not reform our elections. It would deform our elections, change them dramatically. H.R. 1 makes our elections harder to secure, easier to defraud, and cast doubt on every election into the future. That's the last thing that we need in this country, Madam President. This is no time to sow doubt about our elections. People want confidence in the elections. That's why I've joined with Senator Scott of Florida and Senator Hyde-Smith and Senator Lummis to introduce a better proposal. Our bill would make our elections safe and secure and fair. It would give people more confidence in our elections. Our bill says no automatic registration. The House bill repeals all voter ID laws. Our bill says if you want to register to vote, let's make sure you're a citizen. We need to make sure of your identification. Let's make sure you have a social security number. Those are the sorts of things to provide integrity in the election process. Under our bill, states can't just send out ballots in the mail based on old information. And that happened all around the country this year. You can still vote by mail. You just need to request a ballot so your information is up to date. That's the way we've done it in Wyoming. We sent out requests to say, if you'd like a ballot, apply for your absentee ballot, and people did. There's no question about the integrity of that system. It's in a number of states where ballots were mailed out based on old information without a request by a voter for that ballot that led to so many concerns about abuse and fraud. Our bill bans vote harvesting. It means you can't drop off somebody else's ballot. You want to make sure that the collection boxes that they have need to be monitored. Let's see where you turn in your ballot. You turn in the ballot to a ballot box, that ought to be monitored. When votes are being counted, our bill makes sure that both sides are watching. Our bill prohibits delays or pauses in ballot counting. We require an audit of ballot counting system within 30 days after the election. Now, these are basic common sense measures to protect against fraud and error. You want it to be accurate. You want it to be fair. So the differences between our bill and the House 800-page bill could not be more clear. The Republican bill makes it harder to commit fraud. The Democrat bill makes it easier to create and commit fraud. The Republican bill costs almost nothing. The Democrat bill costs billions. The Republican bill strengthens the protections of our elections. The Democrat bill weakens those protections and even gets rid of some of them. This shouldn't be a partisan issue. We should all be against voter fraud. We should make it as hard to commit fraud as we possibly can. So I urge my colleagues to join me with Senator Scott and Lummis and Hyde-Smith. Let us stand for integrity of our elections. Let us give every American citizen confidence and peace of mind that our system works. Thank you, Madam President, and I yield the floor.
President.
The senator from Texas.
Madam President, this Saturday will mark 1 year since Congress passed our first response to the COVID-19 virus. That legislation, you'll recall, received overwhelming support. It passed by a vote of 96-1 here in the Senate and 415-2 in the House. And we know that was not just a one-off. Each of the 5 pandemic relief bills that were signed into law last year received overwhelming bipartisan support. That's not to say that everybody was in perfect agreement about the size and shape of the bills. We had more than our fair share of disagreements along the way. But both sides of the aisle understood the most pressing challenges facing our country and the types of support that were needed to sustain that fight, both when it came to public health and when it came to the economic fallout and recession that resulted. Resources for hospitals and healthcare workers, support for the hardest hit families, assistance for small businesses, and of course, the development, manufacturing, and distribution of vaccines. Not only did we agree on what should be in the bills, we actually also agreed on what should not be in the bills. We were all guided, I believe, by an understanding that the focus should remain on COVID-19. Pandemic relief bills were no place to inject unrelated or partisan preferences. But now that our Democratic friends control the House and the Senate and the White House, they've tossed that principle in the trash. Democrats have drafted their so-called COVID-19 relief bill without the input, the ideas, or support of a single Republican. Now, that's not because folks on this side of the aisle were unwilling. As I remember, there were 10 Republicans, senators, who met with President Biden at the White House and offered a $600 billion alternative that would enjoy broad bipartisan support. This partisan legislation was a choice, not a necessity. A choice, a conscious choice. Last year, the House Majority Whip referred to this crisis as a tremendous opportunity to restructure things to fit our vision. That was Mr. Clyburn. Democrats knew that a bipartisan bill would limit the scope of discussions to policies that were actually relevant to the pandemic. So rather than maintain that relevance to the pandemic, they chose to go it alone. This opportunity to restructure, as Mr. Clyburn said, has been months in the making. And now that Democrats have the numbers they need to make the law without the support of anybody but their own party, they've tacked on an entire liberal wish list and tried to call it COVID-19 relief. But nobody believes it, or should believe it. So see, these are some of the things that are in the so-called COVID-19 relief bill, $1.9 trillion, when hundreds of billions of dollars of money that we appropriated just in December haven't even been spent yet. But here's what is in the Trojan horse, otherwise known as the Democrats' COVID-19 relief bill: funding for climate justice. At a time when many Americans are asking, when can I get the vaccine? How long till my children can safely return to school? Our Democratic colleagues are pushing funding to support President Biden's unilateral climate executive orders. And then there's the funding, the backdoor funding for Planned Parenthood. It's responsible for the most abortions of any other organization in America. Now that's a personal choice for people to make. But asking taxpayers to fund Planned Parenthood so it can perform more abortions is simply irrelevant to COVID-19 relief. It's exploiting another emergency for special interest purposes. This bill expands the criteria for Paycheck Protection Program, one of the most successful parts of the CARES Act that we passed last March. It was designed specifically to keep small businesses afloat. But now, Planned Parenthood can take advantage of the funding, something they were precluded from doing under bipartisan agreement previously. And there's another big political ally for our Democratic friends that would be newly eligible for these small business loans, the labor unions. So now labor unions can apply for and receive money that was otherwise previously directed toward mom and pop businesses, so they could keep their doors open, so they could keep their employees on the payroll. But now it includes labor unions. Many of the labor unions' pension plans in particular have been in dire financial straits for years, long before COVID-19 even existed. Up until now, our Democratic colleagues have not been able to find a way to bail out these mismanaged pension funds. As you can imagine, using taxpayer dollars to cover the mistakes of union bosses is incredibly unpopular, and that's because it's wrong. But the authors of this bill have found a couple of workarounds which they've tucked into this so-called pandemic relief bill. In addition to making labor unions eligible for the Paycheck Protection loans, the COVID-19 relief bill also creates a taxpayer fund to bail out underfunded union pension funds. That's not to help the public generally, that's to help labor union members, which is certainly their issue. I understand why it's important, but I don't understand why my taxpayers in Texas should have to bail out unfunded labor pension funds in other states. Union bosses who've mismanaged these funds and made bad choices will be rewarded with a taxpayer-funded check. And while there are a range of provisions to line the pockets of our friends on the other side of the aisle across the country, the authors of this bill also tried to sneak in more localized fixes, two of which have already been dropped from this bill. In one of the most audacious examples of tone-deaf Washington politics, One of these was an underground rail system in the Speaker's home state of California. An underground rail system. That has nothing to do with COVID-19. The Bay Area Rapid Transit Extension has been in the works for years, and Californians have raised concerns over the rising costs. In 2018, it was projected to cost nearly $4.7 billion. And that estimate has already jumped to $6.9 billion from $4.7 billion. Despite the fact that this rail system has absolutely nothing to do with the pandemic and would serve only the people of one of the wealthiest areas in the country, our Democratic friends provided more than $100 million for this project in their so-called COVID-19 relief bill. Well, fortunately, not any thanks to our Democratic friends who wrote the bill, this completely unrelated project has now been removed from the bill because it violates Senate rules. You're not supposed to be able to appropriate money and authorize transportation projects in a budget reconciliation bill. That's why it's gone. Not because our Democratic friends were embarrassed or had second thoughts after it was pointed out to them the hypocrisy of including that in the bill, but because it violates the Senate rules. Another portion of the bill that would have provided money for a bridge from New York to Canada. Let me think for a minute. Which senator would have stuck money for a bridge from New York to Canada in the bill? Well, there's two senators, one of whom is the majority leader from the state of New York. Well, that's now been struck by our colleagues because it received so much blowback. It was such an embarrassing, irresponsible money grab that it's no longer in the bill. But we'll see if this trend continues and more of the completely unrelated partisan projects are eliminated, because the long list of unnecessary spending does not end there. This legislation also establishes a bureaucrat bailout, an exclusive paid leave fund just for federal employees. If their kids aren't in school full-time because of the pandemic, these employees could take home up to $1,400 a week in paid leave. That's roughly equivalent to $70,000 a year, all to stay home and not work. And these benefits would last for months. Federal employees could take home up to 600 hours of paid leave until September the 30th. Even though President Biden said every adult who wants to get vaccinated will be vaccinated by the end of May. This benefit, this ridiculous money grab, would last until the end of September, long after people had gained antibodies and immunity from COVID-19 as a result of having been vaccinated. Across the country, only about 35% of school districts have returned to fully in-person instruction. If the parents of children at the other 65% of school districts happen to work for the federal government, they can claim these benefits. Even if a school offers in-person instruction, but maintains the option to learn virtually, the parent can still get paid to stay home and not perform any work. Well, parents in my state that don't work for the federal government aren't receiving these same benefits. This is clearly cherry picking to benefit federal employees, to pay them not to work. I respect the work that federal employees do. I respect the work that all government employees do, but to give them preferential treatment in the midst of this pandemic by paying them not to work and using tax dollars from other states and other places that don't enjoy that benefit is simply grossly unfair. Over the last year, countless numbers of parents have balanced the impossible: work and remote learning for their children. It's been hard. I understand that. Many parents have turned their kitchen tables into makeshift offices and classroom spaces until their children were able to physically return to school. Today, less than 7% of the school districts in Texas are fully remote. 7% are fully remote, and 2/3 are fully in person in my state. They've found a way to safely return to the classroom. There's no reason why the Texans who've made that tough juggling act, working and learning remotely, should now have to pay federal employees who have not had to make that tough choice. Madam President, it's simply false advertising to call this a COVID-19 relief bill. It's deceptive and outrageously so. Only $160 billion, 8% of the total cost, is directly related to combating COVID-19. 8%. The rest of the bill, as I've tried to point out, is a variety of, it's a grab bag, really, of partisan priorities, wasteful spending, and counterproductive policy. What's worse, this restructuring, according to Mr. Clyburn's language, to fit the vision of the Democratic Party, will cost taxpayers nearly $2 trillion. That's on top of the $4 trillion we've already spent last year. $2 trillion more. Well, somebody's going to have to pay that money back. And I fear it will not be us, because we'll be long gone. It'll be our children and grandchildren, and at this rate of reckless spending, our great-grandchildren will have to be the ones to pay the money back. This bill is not the answer to the real challenges that face our country posed by the pandemic. We've shown our willingness to work together in a bipartisan way to enthusiastically support the need to provide real relief, both from the public health consequences and the economic fallout associated with the virus. But this bill doesn't even attempt to do that. Fortunately, as a result of the work we did last year, including last December, and by the way, only about 20% of the money that we've appropriated just a few weeks ago, actually a couple of months ago now in December, has actually been spent. Only about 20%'s been spent. And here we are being asked to appropriate $1.9 trillion more. But the good news is the money we spent last year is having real results. The money we invested in treatments, in research and development of vaccines, and now the distribution of vaccines, it's actually making a real difference. We're vaccinating roughly 3 million people a day in America. More than 70 million people have had shots in arms, and we're doing our best to try to get it in people's arms as fast as we safely can. President Biden said we'll get that job done by the end of May. That's wonderful news. The other wonderful news is that unemployment rates are going down and state revenue is going back up. School districts across the country have safely resumed in-person learning. 1 in 5 adults in America have now received a dose of the vaccine, and a third vaccine has now been approved, so that number will climb faster and faster and faster. Every day we're moving closer to the light at the end of the tunnel, and now is not the time to squander the goodwill and trust that the American people have had in us to be good stewards of the public health and our economy by engaging in this sort of embarrassing partisan exercise. Madam President, I yield the floor. I would note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
fired up by Trump's pure fantasy and the presidential election, was stolen from him and enabled by the QAnon conspiracy machine.
Secure surrogate for Bernie Sanders, Nomiki Konst. Nope. And townhall.com political editor Guy Benson.
Well, you chose to use it. The reality here, Guy, as you know very well, is that we have restrictive voting laws in several states throughout this country. Early voting in Arizona, well, you chose to use it. The reality here, Guy, as you know very well, is that we have restrictive voting laws in several states throughout this country. Early voting in Arizona, a Republican state, might I remind you, has been in effect for over a decade. It is overseen by an independent commission. This is something that works. Republicans, Democrats, independents, they use early voting. It only became convenient when Donald Trump wanted to challenge the election because he had his own issues. So, the I understand the Republican Party is in a little bit of an existential crisis. They don't know whether or not to go with the conspiracy QAnon people in the Trump world or go with the logic-based people. So they have to figure out where to go. But the reality is,
there is a lot to unpack there. But I think that most mainstream Republicans have made it very clear they want.
So Republicans have mounted what veteran political writer Ron Brownstein described as the greatest assault on the right to vote since Jim Crow. For years, Republicans have been trying to suppress voting with phony claims of fraud. They would scream fraud and then enact measures to prevent the fraud that they made up. Measures like ID requirements, whose real effect was to, of course, deter Black and brown voters. This has been ugly. But as Biden's victory demonstrated, in the big picture, it hasn't worked. Certainly, it hasn't worked as well as Republicans wanted it to. So if your lie isn't working, what do? Oh, you tell an even bigger lie, of course. Now, it isn't just fraud by individual voters or even groups. It is a massive conspiracy now to steal the 2020 election. If you really believe that happened, then the logical thing to do is make sure it never happens again, right? Except, of course, it didn't happen. And the real goal is to suppress voting. This is a modern day version of burning crosses by the polling places. This is intimidation by legislation. 250 bills in 43 states. It's the number of bills introduced in state houses this last year to suppress voting. It hasn't just doubled or tripled. According to the Brennan Center, proposals to restrict voting have increased 7 times this year. We need to push back against his ugly movement, Donald Trump's ugly movement, and push back hard. H.R. 1 is part of that. It is a bill of voting rights that could help slow the Republican drive. But 2 things must be said. First, while the passage of H.R. 1 in the House is never in doubt, its future in the Senate is, of course, uncertain. And you've heard this here before. We don't know if Democrat Joe Manchin will support voting rights. So this is where Joe Biden has to, stand up. We need his leadership. We need all 50 senators and Vice President Kamala Harris to understand the urgency of this. Either we protect voting rights now, or we pay the price for a generation or 2. It is not complicated. But the other point is that even with H.R. 1, there are ballots to be fought state by state. Arizona Republicans are trying to restrict mail-in voting, even though they've supported it for years, as I said. In Georgia, Republicans are pushing new rules to require an ID to get your absentee ballot and other measures that would restrict the manner in which more than 2 million Georgians voted in 2020. We can't afford to leave this fight all to a piece of federal legislation, as valuable as that would be. Wherever you live, find out what's happening on voter suppression legislation in your state and join the fight to protect voting rights. You got to use it or lose it. This is super important. All right, we have an extraordinary show today. Simon Narode and Jordan Zakarin are back. And in a moment, we have a special conversation with Shannon Foley Martinez. She's a former white supremacist who broke free and now is an advocate for creating community resources against violence. And then just after that, we talked to Puerto Rican activists to discuss the status of Puerto Rico with David Galarza. He's a friend. He's great. You don't want to miss it. Welcome back to the Nomiki Show. Shannon Foley Martinez is currently an advocate for creating community resources against violence. She has worked for school systems, nonprofits, and community organizations, and she's worked with organizations at the UN Office of Counterterrorism, the National Counterterrorism Center, and the Center for Prevention of Radicalization Leading to Violence with UN Women. But the reason why is because she is a former white supremacist. Shannon, thank you so much for joining us. I'm so interested in your story. Just as a personal note, my old roommate won an Oscar last year with her husband for the movie Skin. And I'm sure you know about Skin. It's a short film. I encourage a lot of people to watch it. But I remember tracking her journey where she met a former white supremacist neo-Nazi skinhead and told the story of this movie through that lens. So it's just an incredibly interesting path. So tell us a little bit about your story. I mean, how did you get involved first?
So I'm 46 years old now. I was in the white power movement from around the age of 15 until just about 20. So I've been out for over 26 years. But the very, very shortest version is that I grew up in a dysfunctional household where I never really felt like I belonged. Like I always felt like the black sheep in my family. But when I was young, I played a bunch of sports. I had a bunch of friends and stuff. So I had like other avenues where I felt like I could succeed and I understood like the rules and stuff. And there were places I felt safe. And I had like other adult mentors and stuff like that in my life. When I was 11, we moved from just outside of Philadelphia to rural southern Michigan, just north of Toledo, Ohio. And when I got there, it was like I didn't have the same hair, I didn't listen to the same music, I didn't dress the same way. And like the kids asked me if I was from England because my Philly accent was so strong that they like thought I was from another country. And so the sense of like not really belonging expanded from just inside my own home out into the greater world. At the same time, I was going through adolescence and doing what is the job of adolescence and trying to like, you know, grapple with my identity. Who am I? Who do I choose to be? And I was really drawn towards like counterculture, feeling like mainstream culture was never going to be a place that I really fit in. And at first I was actually really drawn to like 1960s anti-war, like protest movement cultures, and then through some of that skateboarding and then into like the punk rock scene. When I went to high school, I made a choice to go to a private high school across the border in Toledo from where we were living, thinking like, okay, there'd be a bunch of other kids that like didn't go to school together, and so maybe there'd be somewhere that I could like kind of like fit in. And just because like the academics were more challenging and stuff. But when I got there, it was like all the cliques were already pre-established because they all went to like feeder schools together. So they like all already knew each other. So I still, again, felt like I was really on the outside of things. But now there was a law in place at the time that if you lived out of state and went to high school in Ohio, you couldn't play high school sports. And so one of the like last remaining lifelines for me was severed. And so at this point, like I didn't have any trusted adults in my life. I didn't have any coaches who were mentors. And I did some stuff. I was actually like in student council and did mock UN and stuff like that. But it didn't have the same like draw as like, hey, we just won the championships. Yay. And so I spent more and more time like going to punk shows and stuff like that. At the very end of my freshman year, when I was 14 years old, I went to a party where I like lied to my parents about where I was going and started drinking right when I got to the party. And by the end of that night, I was sexually assaulted by 2 men. When I woke up the next day, my first thought was like, did that really happen? And once I was like, okay, yeah, that really happened. My very next thought was like that there was no way I could tell my parents. Because growing up in the household that I did, that my older brother and I were shamed and blamed every time there was something, you know, it's like if you came in with a bloody lip, you know, their first thought was like, how many times have we told you not to play like tackle football? How many times have we told you not to climb trees barefoot or whatever? And there was this protective part of me that was just like, I can't deal with the additional trauma of being blamed and shamed for this sexual assault that just happened on top of the sexual assault itself. So I took all of that trauma completely unprocessed and just shoved it down. Mm-hmm. As we know, trauma doesn't dissipate, it festers. And in my case, it festered into like deep self-loathing. I felt so completely worthless. And the main way that manifested was through rage that I didn't understand. I didn't have the skills or tools to process. I wanted to hurt myself, which I did. I wanted to hurt anything and everyone that like I came in contact with. The angriest people on the periphery of the punk scene where I hung out were the Nazi skinheads. Mm-hmm. I got in fights at every show. And I think the rage within me really resonated with the rage that they displayed. And so I started spending more and more time hanging out with these people, and began like listening to some of the like white power music that they listened to, read some of the zines and literature and stuff that was out there. And what I was doing, which I didn't know at the time, and we know like from research that people that are doing this now don't recognize this either, that I was building an echo chamber for myself. In my case, it was a physical echo chamber that I began to only associate with and only immerse myself in these spaces and around these people. And so everything that I was, whether it was like watching a TV show or listening to music or whatever, I was filtering everything through the lens of this echo chamber. And then there was, the spiral effect where everything was like normalized inside that echo chamber.
So what does a community like that look like? I mean, you were very young, and there's no surprise a lot of people are radicalized when they're young and impressionable and are dealing with issues, trauma, identity, all the things that you've mentioned. But yeah, I mean, was it an older community? Was it all young people? Like, how were there meetings? Like, how does it operate?
Well, in my case, it was slightly older people than me, like older teens, younger 20s primarily. Very interestingly, one of the guys was actually like this big Black guy named Carlos, who identified as like a Nazi skinhead and was completely accepted. So just like that there's more than ideology going on with the dynamics that are there. And I actually, throughout my time in the movement, I actually knew multitudinous people who like we would not identify as white. But there were always these gymnastics and the exceptionality where it was like, okay, well, my ideology is based on like hate of that this other group or whatever, but this person is an exception because I know them or whatever.
It's like the Republican Party now, like,
Yes. It was very much like that. So they were mostly older, slightly older. And then as I was in longer, like I ended up moving all over the country, living with different like cells of people. And towards the end of things that I ended up down south in Georgia and knew a lot more people that were like separatists and stuff like that. And they tended to be much older. They tended to be like 30s and older. But the like skinheads were mostly older teens. There were always like a handful of younger, like just a few younger people around, very few women, which I think was like part of the draw for me, that in the like gender dynamic way that I felt so disempowered, like, I didn't even have empowerment over my own body. Right. But because there were so few women, I could basically go out with whoever I wanted. And so I always ended up going out with like the leader of like whatever sort of cell I was in. And I think that there was this adjacency to power that was alluring to me too. And it was like, and most of my relationships while I was in were like incredibly violent. There were only like 2 that weren't. But I already felt like I was trash and I was worthless. And so that didn't like that messaging, that violence towards me reaffirmed what I already believed about myself. But there was also this sense in which that adjacency to power extended, like not only, they might like hit me, but whatever, I deserve that. It was my thinking at the time, but they will also protect me from other threats and other people in the outside world.
So I mean, what does the white supremacist movement do? How there's such a rise right now where, I mean, we see the Proud Boys and they have actions. When you say a word like a movement, like what is a day-to-day, the day-to-day life of one of these cells? How do they operate?
So I think, there's a shift right now away from movementarianism and that things are far more segmented and, that there's more a sense of the best language I have right now for it is like sort of like a worldview or whatever. So I think very few people who are in right now would identify themselves as being part of a movement. And in present day, what it means to be in or whatever, or the actions and the things that you do are going to vary widely from like, are you somebody that hangs out on like YouTube and moves people over to Discord channels to like talk about stuff? And do you, like what the level of engagement is? In my case, it was, in a lot of ways, it was really just a bunch of people hanging out for a lot of the time. right? And like drinking beer and, you know, and stuff like that. But it was all clouded and cloaked in like neo-Nazi ideology and stuff. And so for us, it was like there would be earlier on while I was involved, you know, that there was like targeted flyering and graffitiing of places of worship, of historically Black or Jewish neighborhoods. There were always fights, sometimes like just at like punk shows or whatever, but then sometimes just like random violence, like against people just, you know, walking down the street or, you know, or whatever. And when there wasn't that there was violence within like the group towards each other. It's like, there's always infighting. There's always, you know, and we see that now. It's like after Charlottesville, after January 6th, it's like, there's all this fracturing that always takes place, and that's endemic. I wish like we did a better job, like in terms of exploiting that to like help dissuade and like break up some of the influence that they have, right? That there's all this like influence that I think we could have if we exploited that a little bit better, because there's always infighting. Different people, you know, grappling their broken egos, grappling to be like the important one.
I mean, when you say flyering, like what are they flyering about? I mean, we see things in New York all the time where someone's, you know, outside of a synagogue, they stage actions, they, you know, have swastikas up. It's horrifying. But I mean, like, what's the agenda? Like, that's what, to torment people, or is it to like to move people? I mean, I know this is a very strange. I know that YouTube right now. I understand the Discord, and they want to grow the movement and radicalize people more. But what's the goal?
Well, and I think even that characterization misses the mark a lot for a lot of what we're seeing too. That like that it's to be offensive. Like, I mean, so
it's like provocative.
If you think like I felt so disconnected and disempowered, right? Like that the allure of the illusion of empowerment of like people being afraid of me and, you know, knowing that I could create a reaction out of people, like that was very seductive. That felt the closest I could probably ever get to like genuine empowerment or whatever, while I was in. So I think a lot of the dynamic, honestly, is to like feel that sense and that allure of power that you have over people, like where it's like I could post something if I was in present day, it's like I could post something to like Twitter or whatever and immediately get people angry and upset and exploit that, and that, you know what I mean, and then that would like feed this like broken need set that I had. And that's some of that, like if there was like targeted firing outside of places, and you know, I mean, part of it too is like just this creation of others. I didn't understand that I felt like the world was a dangerous and threatening place. Like I felt that way all of the time, that it was very expedient for me to hold on to a group of others as the reason why, as like who to blame for why I felt like I didn't have what I ought to have, why I felt, you know, threatened, why I felt like I wasn't thriving. That it was incredibly, incredibly easy for me to like hold on to the explanations of others as the reason for that.
So how did you get out? I mean, that's like, it's almost like a cult, right? Like you hear these stories about how women break free from their cult. Was it similar? I mean, what did you have like an awakening moment?
I think, and you know, because some of the work that I do now is I mentor people as they are leaving these beliefs and spaces and stuff like that. And one of the things we really want the stories to be like very cinematic, where there's like a singular moment, and that's nearly never the case. That it is a process. And for me, I ended up at one point not really having anywhere to go. And I was going out with a guy, incidentally, who was in the Army, who was like a white power skinhead. So not a new problem. And I didn't have anywhere to go, and he was still living on base. But I had met his mom who said I could go live with her and her 3 younger sons. She was like a single mom and had 2 11-year-old boys at the time and a 9-year-old boy. And when
to get away, because you couldn't live on the base, but you wanted
I couldn't
to
live
get
on the
away.
base. I was like, I would end up leaving and like coming back to my parents' house every now and then, like if the relationship I was in got too violent or if I got picked up as a runaway or whatever. And at this point I was finally like 19. So they were just like, you just have to leave. Like you just can't stay here anymore, which was fine with me because we didn't really get along, but I didn't have anywhere else to go. And his mom said I could go live with her. I only found out maybe like a couple years ago that she didn't know like what her ideology was or whatever. But I mean, like if I showed up on my front door, no, she didn't know.
That her son was white supremacist.
No, she didn't.
Did she disagree with it?
Yes, I think wholeheartedly. Yes.
Wow.
Like, she was like a Montessori school teacher and had lived in Brazil and talked about how much she loved like all the different cultures and everything.
What? Like, how does that happen?
I mean, I guess you see, so she didn't see the vile creature that I had become. She saw this young woman who was hurting and needed a place to stay, right? Like, which is, yeah. But essentially what happens as soon as I walk in that door is that my echo chamber begins to break up because I wasn't super well connected with the like white power scene where they lived. And so now there's like other inputs happening and I start, I'm like reading the Chronicles of Narnia to these little boys before bed and like playing Frisbee and playing football. And I was kind of like, oh yeah, like this is what people do. Right. Like, this is like what lives are like, because my life had been so like hyper violent that I was so disconnected from all of the like best things about being alive, like laughter and, other than like mean hearted laughter at someone's expense or whatever, but like joy and wonder and awe and a sense of curiosity and, genuine connection with other people. That was like, oh yeah, like this is like what a life actually entails. And at the same time, she did some stuff where it was like she tangibly connected me with resources I needed to begin to move my life forward. That it wasn't just like, you should go to college. It was like, have you thought about going to college? And if you're going to do that, you need to take your SATs. So here's a number 2 pencil in your hands. Get in my car. I'll drive you to your SATs. That she like connected me with some of these resources in a very tangible way to help me begin to like move my life forward. And so it was like in this environment where it was like, and I didn't have to espouse an ideology to belong. Like I had to do the dishes sometimes or whatever.
Did they like come after you though? I mean, as you were breaking free, did the community, try to take control?
Because it entailed me moving, my folks were living in Georgia and this family lived in Texas, that I wasn't really well known and I wasn't really well connected. So I was able to not feel a sense of like immediate physical danger as I exited. And again, like, I don't know that I identified as it was happening that I was like exiting, right? Like I was kind of beginning to weigh stuff and be like, is this really who I am? Is this because that was not who I was before I got in it? Is this really what I want to die for? Is this really what I want my legacy to be? Is this really like what I want to invest all of myself and my life in? And it was like, and I liked I loved Billy Bragg, loved Billy Bragg. And, and so it was like, how do I like love this music so much and at the same time hold this like ideology that is literally the antithesis of this music that I feel so moved by? And the same with like other like poetry and art and stuff. And I'm like, how do these two things coexist within me?
Right.
And I think the stability and the, in that environment, my broken need set was being genuinely and much more effectively met than the illusion and the coping mechanisms of being inside the movement. And so I think all of that created the space that I needed to shift and begin to examine like what my life had become. And so it was probably like 4 or 5 months that my ideology began to fall away. But it would be like much, much longer before I would be in a space where I would even just be like, oh, maybe you really need to kind of figure out how you got there in the first place and to like sit with the shame of what I had done and what my life had become and process that in anything even remotely resembling a healthy way. Like I still had until I was like 23 years old, I framed what happened to me when I was 14 as simply like, I lost my virginity to two men at a party when I was 14. It took me almost 10 years to be like, okay, there's a word for that. And that word is rape. And, like to be like, oh, well, my whole rest of my life makes a whole lot more sense now that I have like that word for it.
Lightning bulb. Yeah.
But it was like, that was a very messy process, and it's ongoing, right? Like, and it's like this healing and then amends making and, and continued healing and continued amends making.
So Shannon, we have to wrap in a couple of minutes, but if you were to give advice to folks about sort of the state of this radical, I'm not going to call it a movement, but like what's happening in terms of in this country right now with white supremacy, whether it's in your face white supremacy or muted in some way. I mean, what can folks do to be more aware of it and combat it? I mean, this is the work you do now. So
yeah. So I think number one, to educate yourself, immerse yourself in the books and articles and lectures and materials of Black activists, Indigenous activists and scholars, people of color. Learn as much as you can from their point of view about what white supremacy really looks like, because it's not just it's not just this overt and most violent sense. Like, it's endemic. It's the system that we live in, right? And I think we like having overt and violent white supremacists as part of us, because it allows us to externalize white supremacy, and then we don't have to do the internal work that's really required of us to change, right? So if we are immersed in that work and that learning from a personal standpoint, that helps us. I think also learning more about the multitudinous ways people can be traumatized. Like, it's not just acute trauma. That I also had all this developmental trauma, there's historical trauma, there's epigenetic trauma, there's perpetrator trauma, that there's all of these overlappings of trauma and how those things manifest. Because they manifest many times in wanting to simplify life and simplify threats and threat detection. And we do that overwhelmingly through a creation of others as reasons why we feel like the world is a dangerous and threatening place. And I also think it's really crucial. I mean, I'm a mom, I have 7 kids, right? So my whole adulthood has been how do you help people to thrive so they never become me? What do you have to do? And I think one of the pieces that is left out of the dialogue is that we very much have to do a much better job of emotional learning. That there's neuroscience that says even just learning how to name the emotion that you're feeling helps you. And then learning how to just sit with that emotion and feel how it's manifesting in your body. And then even just simple things like that can have an enormous impact, because if you can say, you know what, I'm waiting for this survival money check to show up, and I'm really afraid that I'm not going to be able to pay my rent, that if you can sit with this, and say I feel really afraid. I feel very disconnected from power. I feel like I don't have any path forward. I'm feeling disconnected. If you're able to say those, even just saying and naming those things that you're feeling gives you a better ability to be able to handle them more effectively and holistically. And so I think that is on a very personal one-on-one level, engaging with our whole heart in that emotional learning, and then passing that on to the people and communities around us would have an enormous and nearly immediate impact.
Super fascinating. Shannon, thank you for sharing your story and advice. And I think it's extremely relevant to this moment, and we should all have our eyes open. So, the advice at the end definitely hits home. So Shannon,
thank you
Foley
so much for having me.
Really appreciate your being willing to vulnerable and open. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we'll be right back with David Galarza to talk about Puerto Rican statehood and white supremacy. Sneak peek. Be right back.
Hello? Hello?
Good afternoon. I'm Congresswoman Nydia Velázquez from New York's 7th Congressional District. I would like to first congratulate and thank the organizers of today's first Puerto Rican Diaspora Activism Summit. When we talk about the political future of the island, we must start by recognizing that over a century ago, the United States invaded Puerto Rico. And ever since, the US has pursued its own colonial rule. I think many of us can agree, regardless of our own personal opinion, that the current territorial relationship between the United States and Puerto Rico needs to be rigorously scrutinized. So, what I proposed last Congress, alongside my colleague, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and will be reintroducing in the coming weeks, is a solution to the status question that will empower Puerto Ricans to determine their own political future. The Puerto Rico Self-Determination Act will prompt Puerto Rico's legislature to create a status convention whose delegates will be elected by Puerto Rican voters. This body will develop a long-term solution for Puerto Rico's status, be that statehood, independence, free association, or any other option than the current territorial arrangement. Because I strongly believe that decisions should come from those who will be impacted most, and that is the people of Puerto Rico. If Puerto Rico is to chart its own course, the process must come from the bottom up, not the top down. So please do not hesitate to reach out to my office for more information. I look forward to working with you all to hear your ideas, your feedback, and your vision for a brighter future for the island we all deeply love.
Welcome back. David Galarza is a labor activist. He's a community activist and organizer, a New Yorker, a Puerto Rican, my friend. Thanks for joining us last minute. I was like losing my mind. I was like, who can I call? Because it can't come from me. It's got to come from you. So, all right, like just to remind folks who are watching right now, there is once again, there is a piece of legislation that was put forward yesterday, introduced by the resident commissioner, which is the congressional member, non-voting member from the island of Puerto Rico. She is a Trump supporter, she's a right-winger, and she's a statehooder. She introduced the idea for statehood, but along with some Democrats, which is maddening because I just started tweeting some things out. And of course, well-intentioned progressives were like, what's wrong with statehood? And I feel like I hit my head against the wall every single time. I'm like, so David, because I'm out of words, could you please explain to folks the history of statehood on the island of Puerto Rico? And I'll just follow up with more questions.
Sure. Thank you, Nomiki, first and foremost, for inviting me, even though it was last minute. That's fine. I just got back actually from Puerto Rico about a week ago. So I have a whole new way of looking at things just from the last time I was there, which is pre-pandemic, which has been about a year. I usually try to go a few times a year. I do have family currently living in Puerto Rico, my father, my sisters, and so forth. If we were get into the whole history of the status of issue of Puerto Rico, it could take more than I'm sure the time allotted to talk about this issue now. But yeah. Just in a nutshell, it's very interesting because yesterday it was also a day that that actually the March 1st. Let's go back to March 1st, for instance. It was a day in which several Puerto Rican freedom fighters, led by a courageous woman by the name of Lolita Lebron, back in 1954, led an assault on the U.S. Capitol to proclaim independence for Puerto Rico. And this is a group of we call freedom fighters from Puerto Rico, not like the terrorists that attacked the Capitol on January 6th, that were resolute in their conviction that Puerto Rico should be free. It's been
what year was that?
Back in 1954. And it's interesting that yesterday, when this bill was introduced, was the day in which last year on March 2nd, the last remaining freedom fighter from that original group of 4 passed away, a gentleman by the name of Don Rafael Cancel Miranda. And so today actually is a day that we celebrate or commemorate the national poet from Puerto Rico, also a freedom fighter by the name of, oh my God, I just came back, Juan Antonio Corregel from the town of Ciales, Puerto Rico. So I say that all to say that there's been a long and illustrious, but also heavily oppressed movement for independence in Puerto Rico for many, many years. And it was oppressed in the 30s and 40s and 50s by the federal government that imposed statehood on imposed citizenship on the people in Puerto Rico, and also by the local police forces and so forth.
And the FBI and
yes,
wiretapping the independence movement, and
there's
much more than that.
Was,
but yeah,
it was
imprisoning them.
It was worse than COINTELPRO before COINTELPRO, but it was a very systematic system of taking out, imprisoning, killing, and marginalizing the independence movement in Puerto Rico. But thank you, Nomiki, for starting that whole thing with progressives, because there's a misconception by progressives in this country that think that the ultimate culmination of colonialism is statehood, which nothing could be further from the truth. Right now, we have an issue with DC. I wanted to get statehood for its citizens. And by and large, a lot of people do support that, progressives included, obviously, because it's a matter of civil rights. In terms of Puerto Rico, we personally, so like me and others, seek independence of Puerto Rico because it's a question of human rights, right? It's not the same. It's not the same thing. It's apples and oranges when we talk about the ultimate culmination of their particular status. Right now, we have at least 3.5 million Puerto Ricans, obviously, living on the island that whose citizenship was imposed back in just in time, to use them as cannon fodder for World War I and World War II and the Vietnam War and the Korean War and so forth. And these are folks that, by and large, didn't have a choice whether to become citizens of this country or not. That was an imposition that was forced under the original Jones Act back in the earlier part of the 20th century. What Neera just prefaced, right before we spoke.
Representative Velasquez.
What Congresswoman, we call her Neera, other people call her.
I know, just for folks who aren't aware.
calls her La Luchadora. I kind of think that AOC also fills the bill as well as a luchadora. Introduced a Self-Determination Act that would actually be more comprehensive and more fairer in its intention. Pedro Pierluisi, the governor of Puerto Rico right now, comes from the so-called New Progressive Party. And again, progressives need to get the fact that there's nothing progressive about the New Progressive Party. A year and a half ago, 1 million people took to the streets in Puerto Rico. Nomiki, I think you were there as well, to demand the resignation of another governor from this same party, the statehood party, by the name of Ricky Rosselló. And he was ousted. And Pedro Pierluisi, who's the governor now,
because of a chat. Not that, I mean, he was a bad governor beforehand, but there was a chat that was released. This is an important part. This is the statehood party. The statehood party. A chat was leaked of his inner circle saying the most disgusting, racist, sexist, egregious things. Imagine Trump's inner circle, and that was leaked, and he had to step down.
Yeah, in particular, he made fun of the dad that died during the Hurricane Maria. And it was egregious. It was disgusting. He had something within that chat to just about offend everybody and anybody. And it was the straw that broke the camel's back. And everybody rose up, irregardless of political party, because you can't get 1 million people out into the streets of San Juan and literally shut down all commerce and business in Puerto Rico without having the participation of people across the political spectrum. And we've had that before when we've galvanized people across the political spectrum to get the Navy out of Vieques, to get this horrific gas pipeline project stopped in Puerto Rico, and to really get the release of our political prisoner, Oscar Lopez Rivera. Most recently, there have been some really great victories where people have come together. And I believe that what Neera is talking about now, what other people are talking about now, is to have a fair and inclusive and transparent process to really bring about some kind of status change that will truly decolonize Puerto Rico. We've been through this exercise before. So many times there have been so-called referendums and plebiscites.
Let's talk about the referendums.
That haven't resulted in anything because they've been so-called non-binding referendums. So they
and the turnout's low. It's not.
Turnout historically has been low.
That's important because people keep citing like, oh, but there was a referendum just a few months ago and 52% voted for statehood. First off, that's not overwhelming. Number one, that's not a decision. If you're going to decide what your status is as a country, basically. you kind of want it to be overwhelming. But second, the turnout was extraordinarily low. And it was basically, are you for a state or against a state, which doesn't reflect any of the dynamics on the island. There are multiple parties that take different status issues. But I think what I like, for folks who don't understand all the dynamics here, I'm curious. Okay, so the statehood party is the right-wing party. The person who represents the statehood party in Congress right now was a co-chair for Trump's campaign.
That's right.
The current governor,
Latinos for Trump.
Latinos for Trump, exactly. The current governor is a right-winger. The last governor was a right-winger.
Interestingly enough, though, Nomiki, though, the dynamic about the new progressive parties, they try to cover all their bases.
I know.
And which shows the fallacy also of the two-party system, both in Puerto Rico and in this country. So he's a Democrat as well. Pedro Pierluisi, right?
In America.
Yeah,
Or
but he was also one of the most neoliberal persons that have come out of this fight against the. It was just another thing that we can talk about, the junta. He was actually the lawyer of the Fiscal Control Board that's basically become the colonialism on steroids in Puerto Rico, that basically controls the budget and all decisions that are made in terms of what agencies are getting cut, what schools are being closed down, what laws are being passed. It
supersedes the legislature. So the legislature could pass something, and then suddenly this or the governor, by the way, could sign something, and the Fiscal Control Board, unelected, is just like,
the colonial government has always had little power.
People.
This junta has all powers pretty much to come in and decide what to do. They're unelected and they're unaccountable pretty much to anybody. And they've been the executive director is Natalie Jaresco, and she makes $650,000 a year. And they basically get a blank check to cover all their expenses, both here and in Puerto Rico. They have consultants up the wazoo, so a whole bunch of lawyers and consultants are making a bunch of money. And the Fiscal Control Board is basically the collection agency for all the vultures and all the bondholders and Wall Street investors that made mint out of on the backs of the Puerto Rican people.
So I found interesting, Jennifer Gonzalez, the resident commissioner, the representative from the island, she said in a press conference around this statehood bill that they've presented, which has a lot of Democrats signed on, by the way, supposedly progressives too, like Jamie Raskin, which just blew me away. She said, "Oh yeah, if Puerto Rico is a state, we wouldn't eliminate the debt." So if the argument for statehood that some are making, which is illogical, right, is that the position would be better, like the funding, whatever. I mean, just so folks know, Puerto Rico was it 3 times more poor than Mississippi, our poorest state?
It would be poorer than Mississippi if we came into the union. That's right.
So suddenly there's going to be a dynamic where they'd give more federal funding or something. I mean, there's federal funding that's been released but not used. There's a lot of issues here. But she's saying, oh, but we wouldn't eliminate the debt. So basically, what do you get? You get possibly 2 right-wing senators, not Democrats, because right now there's no Democrats, like real Democrats elected. And there haven't been many over the last, 25 years, right? So, I mean, let's debunk this. If Puerto Rico becomes a state, what happens?
You hit it right on the head, Nomiki. There's not going to be any debt relief, or there's not going to be any relief so much for the people of Puerto Rico, because a lot of the vultures and a lot of the bondholders that continue to prey on Puerto Rico have their hooks into the Democratic Party and the Republican Party in this country. So they're beholden to a lot of those interests just as well. We've come to see that in terms of the overall debt situation in Puerto Rico right now, and Judge Taylor Swain here in New York City, in New York, actually, the federal court is the one that's actually been implementing a lot of these different rules and laws that have been governing Puerto Rico for the last year and a half, I guess. They're not stopping until they collect every penny, every single dime, every single cent that they think they're owed from these so-called triple exempt bonds and COFINA funds and everything else. So yeah, there's not going to be not only any relief in terms of the debt, but let's also remember that there's also other laws that have come into play in Puerto Rico that are going to make it even more difficult for the people of Puerto Rico to get from under this debt, which is these things called Act 20, Act 22, and Law 60, which You know, it's interesting that right now there's a flood of millionaires and billionaires flocking to Puerto Rico to avoid paying their taxes or to dodge taxes because of these laws that were created now, so they can avoid paying their capital gains taxes and other sorts of taxes that have been used as shelters now for people like John Paulson and others. You know, who's
real
also
estate.
John Paulson was a big investor, big Wall Street guy, who was also one of the first hedge fund vultures to embrace Donald Trump.
But he's been buying up real estate.
They've been
for
gobbling
years,
up real estate
hotels.
all over Puerto Rico.
But he didn't use the Act 20. That's a very, side note.
Yeah.
Strangely enough, he actually didn't use Act 20 because probably he just doesn't want to be in Puerto Rico, because you have to be on the island for like 100
But he's influential in getting it passed and supporting it, because obviously there's been an influx of a lot of these millionaires and billionaires that have been coming to Puerto Rico to take advantage of these laws. And it's, you know, it's just created a flood of, you know, of these Act 2020. I mean, they have a society called Act 2022 Society, where they facilitate the move from the states to Puerto Rico so they could take advantages. And then, so you have a situation where the billionaires and billionaires are not paying their taxes. Puerto Ricans tend to pay some of the highest taxes in the world, if not, you know, the U.S. In terms of what's, you know, what the taxes that are going toward paying these COFINA bonds. And meanwhile, the infrastructure and the services, the public services, are falling apart, literally, or they're being privatized.
Right.
So right now, the airport has been privatized, the highways have been privatized.
They're not doing a job with the highways.
They've shut down over 400 public schools,
right?
And it's just, you know, on and on and on. They just continue to privatize. And there's, you know, and I just told you, I just came back from Puerto Rico. There's an unfettered land grab like I've never seen going on, especially along the coast and places close to San Juan, but even in the mountains and even in the countryside, folks are buying acres and acres upon land, and we need that land right now to grow an agricultural economy, a cultural base right now. So, you know, that's, you know, there's a lot of things afflicting the island. This vote, or this status issue, for the most part, is almost like a distraction, especially coming from the New Progressive Party, because they know they have no chance in hell. McConnell has already said, you know, that he's not supportive of such a bill. Chuck Schumer,
that's what I don't understand.
Chuck Schumer also has a close relationship with Nydia and has said that he's not going to move something like this.
So
Nancy
why?
Pelosi, apparently they haven't even approached. I think they just want to set some kind of precedent, or continue to think that they're, you know, that they have some kind of momentum. I think they only had like maybe 50 or 51 members of Congress support or latch onto this bill. I suspect that Nydia and AOC will probably pull together a broader coalition, and they'll also get support in the Senate as well to counter that with the Self-Determination Act that they just put out. And it's just incumbent upon, like you said before, progressives, especially in this country, if they want to really be allies to people in Puerto Rico, they need to study the issue, talk to Puerto Ricans, and just know, you know, it really boggles the mind when I see groups that are like civil rights organizations like the NAACP, for instance, and others take up positions on Puerto Rican status without consulting with people in Puerto Rico.
It's insane. It's absolutely, I mean, I like I said, I'm on Twitter responding one by one to people, and you know, we're doing this on the show as a public service announcement that, again, this statehood issue is written by, you know, a Trump person. So, you know, do your homework. David, I could talk about this for hours. This is like my favorite topic in the world. So hope to have you back on soon. Hope to see you in person soon, post-pandemic. And in the meantime, I gotta do the rest of the show. We're running so late. It's my fault.
Thank you. No
David,
problem.
you are the best. Thank you for joining us short notice.
Take care.
Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. All right, we'll be right back with our fabulous panel. Jordan and Simon have been so patient. So patient. We'll be back right after this very short break. All right. Welcome back to the Nomiki Show. thanks to our fabulous guests for being so patient on today's show has been a little crazy. Simon Narode is part of TNS, the show, the Nomiki show. He is also a former organizer for Bernie Sanders 2020. Jordan Zakarin runs the Progressives Everywhere newsletter and has a different background. I like this background. I like this one more.
Do you want me to put the back one?
No, okay. I like real backgrounds. I'm a big fan.
I didn't know how to change it for a while, so I was just stuck. I was like, I figured it out.
It's being attacked by dinosaurs.
Yeah.
All right, so guys, I saw this clip of Reverend William Barber, who is a great civil rights leader. He has been challenging the narrative around the $15 minimum wage and specifically called out Vice President Kamala Harris. Let's roll that clip real quick to get your reactions.
Yes, good morning to you both. Reverend Barber, let's start right there. What are you asking Vice President Harris to do?
Well, what white and black and brown people in West Virginia are asking her to do, and Schumer to do, and Democrats to do, the people who have to choose between buying food and paying for their heat, they are saying don't take the relief out of the relief bill. Remember that 62 million people in this country were poor and low wealth before we came into COVID. So they're saying, Senator Schumer, keep it in the bill as it came over from the House. Vice President Harris, override. There's a history of doing this. Hubert Humphrey challenged the parliamentarian, Nelson Rockefeller, even Trent Lott fired a parliamentarian because he wouldn't give him tax cuts for the wealthy. Put it in the bill, override it, and then see if there's 60 votes in the Senate to override the presider. The parliamentarian does not make the rules. The parliamentarian advises, and there is a history of this. We are in a serious situation. 40% of African-American workers would be lifted out of poverty and low wealth if this were to pass. We know, we did a study last year with the Economic Policy Institute, said if it happened immediately, 39 million workers would rise up to a living wage, which is, by the way, already a compromise because it should be $20-some. And the March on Washington called for a minimum wage of $2 an hour, which today would be $15. But also it would pump $330 billion into the economy. And if you add to that expanding healthcare and infrastructure, it will actually create jobs over the long haul, and it would help everybody. And lastly, we can't regionalize this because the poor, 1/3 of all the poor live in the South. The poorest persons in Appalachia and Alabama, they have been hurt the most by a pandemic, the first to go to work, the first to get infected, the first to get sick, the first to die. And lastly, let us not remember, it's $7.25 for some people, but for restaurant workers, it's $2.13 an hour.
Yep.
This is the time we have to make a decision of whether we're going to play to the corporate interests or whether we're going to finally establish justice,
William Barber for president. That's all I gotta say. Jordan. I mean, like, that's the case right there. It was the most, to my opinion, most beautiful, he hit every point. You know, you say you're for people of color, you say that you care about these communities, you say you care about frontline workers. Okay, lift them out of poverty. Right. These are the numbers. You say you want to regenerate the economy. What better way to regenerate the economy?
You know, it seems to me that there is, some Democrats really value the institutions of the Senate, but it's hard to value those things, like with William Barber, when they have been used as institutions to keep you down for generations. Those traditions and institutions are only good for a certain number of people. Decided back in the 1830s, they decided how the filibuster would work. Continuing on, it's been so used to harm people of color over and over and over again, people in poverty over and over and over again. And I think just today, there's no reason to take the minimum wage out other than Democrats just don't want to do it. You know, there is you can blame Republicans, they'll filibuster no matter what, but you can get rid of it. You can get rid of the filibuster. You can get rid of the parliamentarian. It's irrelevant. You know, it's like that. There's no reason to listen to them. And so this is a choice the Democrats are making. And unless they, want to win more elections, they will reverse course. But you spend years and years getting told, all right, $15 an hour, saying, okay, we're going to go for $15 an hour. A bunch of states have done it. If you're not doing it as a Democratic Party, you're allowing a few people, and I'm sure it's more than just Sinema and Manchin. I'm sure a bunch of people are hiding behind them because they would be putting pressure on them if they really, really wanted it. This is a choice, and it's a disappointing one and one that's going to come and bite them back. I mean, Joe Manchin, he says $11 an hour is okay. In a recent story, he said that'll take people, a family of 3 to $22,000 a year, which is just above the poverty line. That's like what he wants. If that's like his line for helping people, just so you're not technically in an incredibly low, and the poverty line is way lower than it should be. So
Yeah, I thought it
as
used
long
to
as
be
you're
like
not
35,000.
Yeah,
Wow.
well, as long as you're not like eating out of the trash can 7 days a week, we're good. If that's your line, like Democrats will stop you from eating out of the trash can sometimes.
I
You're not going to do
remember
well.
in the DNC platform committee meetings, which we'll get to in a second, I remember being there in 2016, and a woman got up, and we were fighting against Social Security cuts, which, like, why are we even having this conversation in the Democratic Party? And a woman got up there and she talked about how senior citizens in her community were eating cat food because they couldn't survive. And the response, like almost 2 seconds later, this is all on camera, from their the person that was moving votes was, vote it down, vote it down, vote it down. Like, that was their physical response. And like what you just laid out, Jordan, I mean, this is the Democratic Party. It's like the curtain's been pulled back, and like their only excuses, well, it's like a process thing. I mean, Simon, I don't even have a question now. I'm just like, how do we, like, what do we do when we're dealing with a party that's like not even responding to public pressure anymore?
Yeah, exactly. It's sort of like they value process over any actual outcome. They sort of imagine the government working in this way where you have like all of these sort of like regime of like rules where everything, if it follows the rules, will like outcome in justice or something, which is not how government works. It's not how anything political gets done. And if Joe Biden wants to be like the FDR style president, he's really got to switch things up here, because I can tell you, FDR would be fighting for this. And Joe Biden hasn't been fighting at all. I mean, proposing, to put the $15 minimum wage in there is good, but that's not fighting. Fighting is the next step. It's what you do when all of these forces come together and try and stop this from going through. So I would like to see a fighter. We don't have one. So we have to sort of fight for ourselves, and it's a real struggle. I mean, obviously ideal would be that we just have like everybody is part of a union, everybody's able to organize collectively in their workplaces and negotiate for something even better than $15 an hour. But, as we've talked about on the show, labor is really struggling. Like people are not able to advocate for themselves in their workplaces. And so we're looking to the government to just make one sweeping change just to raise the minimum wage to get some people barely above the poverty line. And it's not happening.
It's going to get worse. I mean, that's what's so disgusting about this is that, you made a joke about the trash cans, but we don't even know. Like, we don't even know what the eviction crisis is going to look like once they start evicting people. I mean, to me, I think what's so jarring about this is how little shame they have. And if they are not feeling shame when like the world sees what's happening and we're on the precipice of, who are they defending? Like, there are companies who are choosing, like Amazon, to pay their workers $15 an hour. Who are they defending, Jordan?
I think they are honestly stuck in the politics of the past, and they are defending themselves against attack ads that don't exist. Like 63% of Republicans, or 53, whatever it is, a majority of Republicans support the Recovery Act, even with the $15 minimum wage. 2/3 of Americans support the $15 minimum wage. This is not a huge ask. This is not saying like, please send everybody like 7 gold bars and, whatever. This is not a big deal, and yet they turn it into a big deal. Today alone, and whether it's Joe Manchin or someone else, they decided to lower the threshold for people who will get stimulus checks from $100,000 phase out to $80,000. There is literally no reason to say to 17 million people, Donald Trump gave you a check, but the Democrats will not. That is a choice and like a self-inflicted wound. And I don't know if they think it makes them seem responsible, but that's fine. Like, imagine, you're in the rain, a lightning storm. It's, people are shooting bullets at you. You get up to the front door of a store and you, please let me in. And they're like, sorry, we're closed technically 1 minute ago. That's like what Democrats are doing.
Yes.
And they're saying we're following the rules and we're just being conservative and knowingly and willingly letting people suffer. 17 million people will not get this check. 17 million people will be bitter and angry and say, hey, look, You said if we voted for Democrats in January, if they took over the Senate, they would immediately get $2,000. They're not getting $2,000, first of all. Second of all, 17 million of them will not be getting anything.
And good on Reverend Barber for calling out Kamala Harris, because if she has any interest, it's getting elected president. But right now, the pathway, and surely she can smell it, right? She can see where the wind is blowing. That if they don't do anything in 2 years, not only are they not going to have a Democratic House or Senate, but they won't have a future Democratic president, Kamala Harris. Like, so much needs to be done to get to that place. Just for the sake of time, I want to play this clip from our favorite person, Bill Kristol, on Neera Tanden's decision to step out of the OMB position, the fight. Let's play that.
House pulling the nomination of Neera Tanden to lead the Office of Management and Budget. And I know you know her, you've been very vocal, that you thought that it was not right, the heat that she took for her tweets and her nomination overall. They've now pulled it, right? So that's going to be a failure for that nomination. Is it the right thing to do?
I mean, if they don't have the votes, they don't have the votes. She would have been a good OMB director. I think it's ironic that the entire Republican Party is against someone who would have been a tougher OMB director, a little more resistant to big government liberal spending programs, I would say, than whoever's now likely to get the job. But she'll still be in the administration, and life will go on, I suppose. I do think it's not an accident that they went after. I mean, she's not the most liberal person who's been nominated, yet somehow she was took the brunt of the assault. Why exactly was that?
Well, and you know what? I'll leave it there, but I just note quickly to our viewers, right? You have Republicans allied with people like Bernie Sanders, right? They didn't like her, Bernie Sanders, and the progressives because, she was, they thought, too conservative, too in bed with Wall Street. So it makes the point you make, right? Wasn't as if Republicans went after the most progressive person that they were putting forth. Thank you both.
So what I find interesting about that is the argument that they've been making is like, she's so progressive, and Erin Burnett is by no means a progressive. She just like called it out. All right. I mean, my obviously this is a moment where a lot of people are excited that have dealt with Neera Tanden head to head, including myself. Thank you for all the Politico hit pieces, Neera. It was real fun. But she's not going away. I'll tell you that. She's going to get something out of this. What do you think she'll get, Jordan?
I'm glad to see that at least someone over the last year has received some sort of, second job offer compensation for after having to, be laid off from or let go from a job opportunity. Like the only person in like 20 million people in America to get a second chance with a job. So that's exciting. I don't care about Neera Tanden. I'm not sad that she has to leave. She, if I can't get jobs because of my Twitter, she shouldn't be able to get jobs because of her Twitter. I will say that, it's interesting that they said they would fight tooth and nail for her. It didn't happen. I don't know if they're doing that for minimum wage. I hope that maybe this shows that they should get rid of, the Republicans will work with them, that they should get rid of a filibuster, that they should maybe go around the rules. Maybe that losing one of their crown jewels of icky conservativeness will help them realize. I mean, hopefully that's the silver lining because, I'm not too worried about Neera Tanden's future. I'm not worried about her bank account too much. I just hope that they learn a lesson that, Republicans are not going to work with you no matter what you give them.
Oh, I'm worried about her future, not because I care about her future. I care about where she's going to start throwing missiles next.
I'm not worried on her behalf, I should say.
That's better, yeah. Okay, Simon, where's she going to go? Where do you think she's going to throw the missiles next?
Well, what I want to know is if she's going to go back to Twitter. She's just made all these like public apologies for all of these tweets that she made. And I'm very curious if she's going to go back with a vengeance and be like, I'm out for blood. All the
take it back.
Who didn't confirm me.
Maybe she'll come out in support of No, she's blaming Bernie.
No.
Yeah. They were blaming conservatives, and now they're blaming Bernie. They can't keep it straight. All right. So last but not least, MSNBC is calling to challenge institutional establishment Democrats. What is going on, guys? When MSNBC is now moving to the challenging the establishment. I mean, back to the original conversation of if Capital is saying, okay, yeah, $15 minimum wage. If MSNBC is challenge some of these Democrats, who's controlling the Democrats right now? This is so interesting. All right, let's play the clip. If it wasn't so
well,
painful,
even before we have
it's
a clear
fascinating.
idea of the 2022 primary calendar, progressives outside of Congress are feeling more emboldened to launch these primary challenges against sitting Democratic leaders and Democratic incumbents, including the latest Congressman and Democratic House Majority Leader Steny Hoyer, who, as you know well, Casey, soared to re-election last cycle with over 60% of the vote, faced a number of primary challengers, and came out relatively unscathed. But when I talk to progressive candidates and organizers, especially those who are lining up against him, they're saying, look, we're looking at the country's racial demographics changing. We're looking at the fact that we're in a post-Me Too era, a post-George Floyd era. And we feel that because the political landscape is changing in this way, it's changing such that it will reward diversity and diverse candidates who ultimately crop up and they hope become successful. You know, the two folks who have already lined up to challenge Leader Hoyer are both Black, both openly campaign on these kind of race and gender dynamics that I just laid out, and are both open progressives who are saying, look, we need to get a number of things done, even though Democrats control the House, the Senate, and the White House. They're still not happy that enough is being done.
And in terms of Hoyer specifically, I mean, he's obviously a longtime leader. He's the #2 House Democrat. He's someone that has been well respected, frankly, on both.
I find this fascinating because, like I said at the top, like, first off, to get this coverage, let's just flash back for the youngins watching right now. 5 years ago, what is it, 2021? 5 years ago, you couldn't even talk about campaign finance reform on cable news. Then, like, you know, of course, like, they didn't have a lot of Bernie, but like, the reality is these conversations just didn't really exist. Now, it's not because there's a primary. It's not because, you know, it's Hillary versus Bernie and they have to put some leftists on. It's not because of a crowd of, this is, they're initiating this conversation, like, with some of the biggest leaders. So what do you think is happening, Jordan? Like, is this just they're looking for drama, or is it something more?
I think that people are lots not smarter but more informed after 4 years of Trump. I think learning the different laws that between Robert Mueller and between how the Senate would work and how Kavanaugh would be confirmed, how Amy Coney Barrett would be confirmed, how voter suppression works. I think that, to their credit, viewers are much more informed. I don't know if it's because of cable news, but I think cable news probably gets the feedback and sees on Twitter and sees on social media that, like, oh, people are talking about these things now and not just like pantsuits or something. So I think it does make a difference. And I think that people have become more educated. And I think that also will push Democrats more. I think that MSNBC, while a corporate network, is also responsive to viewers to some degree. And, you know, they can't just cheerlead Joe Biden's dogs. And his grandkids call him Pop. No one cares because we're all suffering. And so I think that, to a degree, as people get more educated about these sorts of issues, we've had a lot of time to sit at home and read about them, that's for sure. Then, you know, cable news has to go alongside. And then when Steny Hoyer calls for the end of the filibuster, you know, that's kind of signals that it's a mainstream position.
It's amazing. This dynamic is incredible. I mean, if, like you said, if everyone was suffering, if I was reading about this and if I was watching a movie, I'd find it really interesting. Simon, other than the fact that it includes massive pain and suffering of Americans starving and soon to be homeless.
I mean, the political tides are changing. You know, there is a lot of energy around progressive candidates right now. And I mean, MSNBC would be remiss not to report that. I wonder, though, if they knew how this reporter was going to be framing this story, because they could easily have, like, said, oh, look at, like, Democrats are challenging Democrats right now, you know, like, we just secured the White House and now these dangerous progressives are trying to destabilize everything. And I don't know if they thought they could spin the story that way, but the reporter definitely framed it in a different light.
I mean, Axios is no, like, progressive publication. So that was really amazing. You know, the conspiracy theorist in me is like, well, how much of this stuff was just generated by, like, the Clinton campaign for years? And, like, was it really capital, or was it, like, the Clinton campaign just, you know, trying to eliminate Bernie Sanders because they hated, I don't know, maybe the conspiracy theories.
I still think we see a lot of the base Democrats saying, well, what can we do? It's better than having no Congress. It's better than not being able to pass anything. Yeah. What can they do about Manchin? Maybe he'll become a Republican. There's still plenty of, like, base Democratic MSNBC head voters who are, you know, big riding with Biden hashtag fans. Right. So I don't think the base is totally moved, but I think that they're a lot more aware of why they say they can't do things. And I think there'll be a lot of frustration, especially what we saw with Georgia voting rights. If they don't pass, and we saw the Supreme Court yesterday, if they don't pass HR 1 for the People Act, the John Lewis Act, that's it. That's the ballgame. And so I think that if there's pressure on anything, it's going to be that. And I think that that's undeniable. You can't even say that, well, a little bit is better than nothing. Like you either pass that or you don't, or you lose.
Exactly. That's what we opened with today. It's got to pay attention to this stuff. The Republicans are well-funded, well-organized, and on attack right now with voting rights.
They rewrite the rules, and we just play by the bad rules and say we can't rewrite them.
That's it. And then we blame the rules.
Yep.
Oh, I don't know. It's like the interpretation of the rules. Well, maybe you should be present. All right, guys. Always a pleasure. Love Wednesdays. Thanks for joining us. Thanks to everybody else for joining us for this extra long show. Jordan Zakarin, Simon Narode. Enjoy your weeks. We will see you next week. And to everybody else, thank you for joining us. What do we have here? Dorsey, I just got a blank message from you. That's how we have to communicate. All right, here we go. Shout outs. We got lots of shout outs today. Rick's Americana. I attended your LA Super Tuesday event a year ago today. Thanks for the mug and most of all the chance to meet Michael Brooks. Forever in your debt for that. Yeah, I posted something on Instagram today that 1 year ago today was Super Tuesday and we had our first and only live event. Hopefully we can do more in the future, but it was an amazing event. It was last time I saw Michael Brooks. Michael joined us for the event in LA, and so did Nando Villa, so did Justin Jackson, Francesca Fiorentini, Alona Minkowski, and Lucy Flores and David Day, and they were all on stage that night, and it was a somber night. I mean, people showed up. We were hoping that Bernie would have won, but it ended up being a little bit more somber. It was still, it's good to be in company of friends, and I'm really grateful that I had the chance to see Michael. So thanks for that. Kyler Asado, can Shannon come to Orange County, California, or help us with some of the work in Orange County and Huntington Beach? We have a local professional that can help. Oh, that's interesting. I will put her information into the information section on YouTube. Kowalski from Nebraska, spreading dry fertilizer 150 miles south of my home in Kansas. Nebraska has higher taxes and minimum wage, and our roads are better and have a higher median income. Interesting. Nebraska GOP wants to be like Kansas. So dumb. Nebraska's Democratic leader is my friend Jane Klebb. Love her. She's a Bernie person. Pete from Oakland. Wow, Nomiki, another incredible stream. I appreciate the work you do so much. Thank you. I am proud of our show today. I feel like everybody was amazing and there was so much content. And anytime, we can talk about Puerto Rico, I get really happy too. Thanks to Professor Harvey K. We see you in that live chat. Thanks for mixing it up. And Midi Docs and Mario for working those algorithms. And of course, huge thank yous to our moderators, Bob C., Chokin, The Orb, and Chuck Diesel on YouTube. And over at Twitch, Dorian Sapiens, A Difficult Truth, Nightbot, Armeens, Nug Wrangler. You guys are all keeping the chat rooms troll free. We are so appreciative to you. All right, we will see you tomorrow. Tomorrow, guys, special show. It is an all Cuomo show. You've been asking for it. You're going to get it. I'm really excited, also very scared, because anytime you talk about Cuomo, he comes after you. But I feel like he's got other people that he is more focused on right now than little Nomiki. All right, be safe, be well, and stay in solidarity.